question time today to the Minister for Education and Skills. And the first priority question is in the name of Deputy Charlie McConalogue. Could have order, please, now. Deputy McConalogue.
Minister, this is to ask you if you will address concerns that the combination of rising rental prices and a lack of supply of accommodation for students attending third-level institutions will prohibit a large proportion of students from living within a reasonable distance of their campus accommodation next year. As you know, Minister, there was a crisis in student accommodation last year. There is a bigger crisis this year, and I hope that you will be able to update the House on some measures that you have taken or what you have done in particular to help address that and increase supply.
Minister, number 100.
Thank you, Deputy. I appreciate the concerns regarding the availability of accommodation for students, and for that reason I have asked the Higher Education Authority to report on this issue. The HEA are currently working on a draft report on student accommodation which will be available shortly and will give us an up-to-date picture of the situation. In that context, I will continue to work with government colleagues and stakeholders to explore ways to increase the availability of student accommodation where needed. Many parts of the country are not experiencing the pressure on accommodation that we are seeing in Dublin and, to a lesser extent, Cork and Galway. Some institutions provide a range of accommodation, and all colleges have an obligation to work with students' unions and other groups to provide students with details on accommodation options. Initiatives such as USI's Homes for Study are of help to students and list suitable accommodation available to rent across Ireland. In the longer term, the Government is committed to addressing the housing shortage through Construction 2020. This will not resolve all of our problems immediately, but I am confident that the implementation of Construction 2020 will provide us with a sustainable housing stock in the medium to longer term.
Charlie McConalogue.
Minister, the unfortunate reality is that as Minister, yourself and indeed your predecessor have taken no actions to address and try and bring some measures that would actually improve the accommodation crisis which is facing students this summer. This was a crisis in 2013. It was a crisis last year in the summer of 2014. And it's an even bigger crisis, Minister, this year. Students are already, Leaving Cert students, in the cities of Dublin and Galway in particular, where the crisis is most acute, already scurrying around town trying to find accommodation, and actually have started paying for their accommodation already for those who actually have found it, because so great is their fear that they may not be able to source it. Meanwhile, Minister, while this has been happening under the nose of the Government, there has actually been no measures taken by you. You refer to the fact that you have asked the HEA to put together a report. Minister, a report is not going to address this. This is a crisis now of 3 years standing. In March, you indicated that report that you've requested was to be available in April. Today you're telling us that it will be a few weeks away. Meanwhile, Minister, students are increasingly concerned as to whether they'll be able to find accommodation and how on earth they'll be able to afford it.
Thank you.
Can I ask you specifically, Minister, is there any other measures which you might take at this very belated stage which could help address this position, or at the very minimum try and ensure that some steps are taken that this crisis won't be even worse next year?
Thank you, Minister.
Than it is to be this summer.
Well, I have engaged, as I said, with the HEA, but also with the Union of Students in Ireland in relation to this issue, and also with some of the individual universities and IOTs. Many of them do provide extensive amounts of accommodation, but I accept that there is a particularly critical issue in the Dublin area and to some extent in Galway and Cork. I am aware from discussions that some of the third-level institutions are actively engaged in looking at additional accommodation concerns, you know, as I say, I'm aware of that. As I say, the HEA is going to report as well and will report in the very near future on this issue. But it is something that is under consideration in terms of the Construction 2020 strategy for the longer term. But in the meantime, there is active engagement with the higher education institutions in terms of providing extra accommodation for students.
Thank you. Deputy Charlie McConalogue.
Minister, again, all we're hearing from you this morning is that you're engaged with student unions, you're engaged with the HEA and with institutions. You mentioned that you're aware of some measures they may be taking. Maybe you might enlighten us as to what measures they're taking. If you're aware of it, Minister, I would like to know about it, and I've no doubt the students who are facing that accommodation crisis this summer would like to know about it. The reality is there isn't anything happening, apart from actually gathering reports to basically cover the government's embarrassment at this stage, at the fact that the government have done nothing to try and address this. The figures show that the further away students are from a third-level institution, and indeed the closer they are to the grant thresholds but yet missing out on it, the lower their participation at third level. That chronic situation of participation for those categories is only going to get worse by this crisis which you're overseeing, coupled, of course, with the €1,000 increase in the student registration fee which you've delivered for them, and indeed the abolition of postgraduate grants entirely for postgrad students. Now we see, Minister, you're coming in here today and you have nothing to tell us because you have done nothing. This government has done nothing to address this issue for the last 3 years, and it's unfortunately the many hard-pressed third-level students across the country, many Leaving Cert students who have now just completed their exams, that are going to suffer as a result of this. You can offer us nothing this morning either to show that there's going to be any real measures taken by you over the next 12 months that might actually ensure that this doesn't get worse next year.
Thank you. Minister, to conclude.
Well, I mean, I'm somewhat surprised at the vehemence of the Deputy's response, because the collapse of the construction industry is a lot of the reason why we don't have available accommodation.
Please, Minister.
Up to some years ago, students were able to find accommodation, but the construction industry collapsed because the economy collapsed. And funding had to be cut, including the issue around the student registration, because of the state of the economy, and you're very well aware of that, Deputy. Now, just in terms of specifics, and I have said to you that I am aware that some of the institutions are engaging. There is, for example, the Strategic Investment Fund, which was set up by the government, which is one area of possibility in terms of funding that is being explored. So that's just one example. But as you know also, there have been some schemes, including the one I referred to in my initial response in relation to the USI Homes for Study scheme, and there are others that we have discussed with USI as well. And a practical response is what is required, but also a more medium-term strategy, which the government has announced in terms of the Housing 2020 strategy, which includes student accommodation.
Thank you, Minister.